Hey, it's Mr. Spencer. I'm so glad you're here joining us. We're talking about how small word choices can have great significance at the end of chapter 8 in Gatsby's death. Now, just so you know, there is a chance for you to read more about this. I have the scholarly articles folder. It's under the Great Gatsby folder on It's Learning. Okay, you can check out any of these and read them. Some of them are very interesting, and one you might find interesting today is the article 6, A Son of God. So if you're interested in checking that out, I found tons of good articles you could read. You could pull them up here on your laptop or your phone. Even if the PDF looks rotated here, you just click here and you can do rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. You see that? So that might be a good way for you to check them out and read an article, find out more. Now, what I've been looking at today is the symbolism, the motifs, and a close reading of page 161 and page 162 at the end of the book. Okay, so what about Nick's strange detached description of Gatsby's murder? Page 161. Myrtle has been killed. Nick discovers Gatsby lurking in the bushes outside Tom and Daisy's house. He stays up all night with Gatsby and ends up sympathizing with Gatsby's endless capacity for hope and saying goodnight to him. Do you sympathize with Gatsby here? I mean, he just ran over Myrtle. Mr. Spencer, I thought he said Daisy ran over Myrtle. No, Nick thought that Daisy ran over Myrtle. Gatsby agreed after hesitating. I don't know. Do you trust Gatsby? Who ran over Myrtle? Who was driving the car? You can look more into that if you're interested at the end of chapter 7. It's a strange moment on the bottom of page 143. Regardless, Myrtle's dead, and Gatsby seems to find some calm after staying up all night lurking in the bushes outside Daisy's house. Despite Myrtle's brutal manslaughter, the story becomes peaceful at this point. Chapter 8, very peaceful. We've gone from a climax to a falling action. So things have calmed down a little bit. Okay, follow along with me. As the falling action starts to calm back down, Gatsby readies himself for a swim. Nick has to go to work, though, and he says goodbye. And he adds right before he leaves, "Hey, Gatsby, you're worth the whole damn bunch put together." He says he was always glad he said that. And little did Nick know those are the last words he would ever say to the Great Gatsby. Gatsby grabs an air mattress. Say that 5 times fast. Gatsby grabs an air mattress. It's like a pool float to take into the pool before his servants close it up for the winter. This is apparently the end of summer, the beginning of autumn. It's a transitional time. You see the symbolism there? Transitioning, life and death. Summer, fall, winter. Yellowing trees, frightening leaves indicate the season for us. Myrtle's blood is ostensibly still stained on the front right fender of Gatsby's yellow car. You notice that? It needed repair because that's where he hit Myrtle. But Gatsby insists that his chauffeur not take his yellow open car out under any circumstances, likely to keep any evidence of the hit and run under wraps. Nick spends a weird amount of time describing Gatsby walking towards the pool with the pneumatic mattress. The pool float. Ask yourself, who's the narrator here? Nick has already left Gatsby's house. We've been in a first-person point of view throughout most of the book. One exception was the end of chapter 4. Jordan took over the narration for a few pages at the end of chapter 4. Gatsby's story seems to get paraphrased by Nick a little bit in chapter 6 with the young James Gats of North Dakota. But here, the point of view seems shifted too. I wonder if it's just ambiguous, if Fitzgerald intentionally leaves it uncertain who's narrating this. Is it a third-person omniscient narrator? Or perhaps this is what Nick learned from the investigation, the inquest. There was maybe some sort of investigation of Gatsby's murder, and Nick learned these details later from witnesses like the servants and the chauffeur that were there. But if it's also maybe just like Fitzgerald takes out a third-person omniscient narrator, he's done this in several of his short stories, so it's actually not uncommon for Fitzgerald to do this. Could the omniscient narrator also be called maybe godlike? The symbolism is heavy in this scene. Godlike? As a reader, when an author spends a strange amount of time describing something seemingly minor, you know it must be either to build suspense or tension, explore deeper symbolism, or maybe add significance or depth to the scene, but thematic significance. So we're building on the themes here. Red, white, and blue. Gatsby's about to be murdered. George Wilson has learned from Tom and Michalis, the Greek cafe owner, that it was a yellow car that ran over Myrtle. And Tom confirms that that was Gatsby's car. George Wilson tracks down Gatsby's address, and he's about to shoot Gatsby for killing his wife. And then George commits suicide. The scene is not written with a tone of excitement or spectacle. Instead, Fitzgerald slowly crafts the details like a modern film would slow down, but they didn't have movies like this in 1920. Fitzgerald slowly crafts the details to include lots of color symbolism and heavy symbols of religious imagery. Stick with me here. I'm stretching the interpretation, but I think you'll find this useful. Is Gatsby's death similar to Jesus's? Some critics have noted that in this scene, it's similar to the story of Jesus being crucified in the New Testament of the Bible in the Judeo-Christian traditions. Like the Stations of the Cross, Gatsby interacts with a few different friends and disciples, like Nick, before meeting his maker. Rest in peace. Like Jesus struggling to carry the cross, Gatsby struggles to carry and shoulder the weight of something that actually is probably lightweight. An air mattress, a blown up pneumatic air mattress, a pool float. Is it supposed to be big and heavy? Could the pool float represent symbolically the cross for Gatsby's figurative crucifixion? What do you think of this? I'm going out on a limb here. See if you can stick with me. Okay, why else would Fitzgerald add such small minor details? The chauffeur offers to help Gatsby bear the burden of his cross, but Gatsby shakes his head and he continues alone. Do you need help, Mr. Gatsby? This is similar to Simon of Cyrene, who offered to help Jesus carry the cross in Luke chapter 23, verse 26 of the New Testament. Okay, you can check that out if you want to click and learn more about Simon of Cyrene. Okay, but back to this. If Nick is not the narrator of this passage, could that imply that a third-person omniscient narrator sees everything? Sometimes a third-person omniscient narrator is called godlike. Like God, or Dr. T.J. Eckelberg of the Valley of Ashes. Does God watch over this scene rather than Nick? Also, note the horrifying details in this passage. Okay, like the horrifying crucifixion of Jesus, the passion of Gatsby. After Gatsby has lost the old, warm world, Nick, or God, godlike omniscient narrator, imagines that Gatsby must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky, frightening leaves, grotesque rose, raw sunlight, scarcely created grass, poor ghosts, and an ashen, fantastic figure. Maybe the ashen, fantastic figure is George, who's coming to kill him from the Valley of Ashes. That's where George lives. That's where his auto mechanic shop is. Or is that Pontius Pilate, the one who was charged with being responsible for Jesus' death by the Romans? And Pontius Pilate was executed for that later by the Romans. The fantastic figure that is gliding toward him is very similar to the alliteration FF, fantastic figure, on chapter 2, page 23, when the Valley of Ashes was described earlier as a fantastic farm. You see the F and the F alliteration. Like Myrtle's body run over and left by the side of the road in the Valley of Ashes, or in our godforsaken modern world, this Valley of Ashes we live in, or in Psalm chapter 23, verse 4 of the Bible, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Gatsby doesn't seem afraid here. Gatsby's not intimidated. Does Gatsby know his fate? It's like a Shakespearean tragedy here. On the next page, notice how carefully Fitzgerald is describing the murder. It's like slow motion. Does life slow down before a death experience? A near-death experience? Does life slow down there? Adjectives and adverbs used to set the pace here. Check them out. Scarcely, faint, barely, little, hardly, irregularly, small, scarcely, accidental, twice, touch, slowly, tracing, thin, little way. The word choices used here slow down the pace of the prose text for the reader. The slow pace adds to the suspense. I also argue that the mood is evocative of like a slow church service or a funeral. This is an elegy. Before Gatsby's death, not after his death, but it's almost like our narrator, our godlike omniscient narrator, knows that Gatsby's going to die. Compare this to the fast cars in chapter 7 when Myrtle's death occurs. Bam, bam, she's dead. But during these climactic moments, Fitzgerald takes us out almost omnisciently and pulls us away from the action and changes up how these deaths occur with both Myrtle and Gatsby. It's very curious. After Gatsby's death, as the air mattress revolves slowly in the water, Gatsby's blood flows into the water, making a thin red circle in the water. This mixture of blood and water may evoke the blood and water flowing from the side of Jesus after he was pierced in the side by a spear in John chapter 19, verse 34. The Stations of the Cross before the crucifixion, one of the soldiers with a spear pierced Jesus' side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. Curious. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were used in the New Testament of the Bible to give an account of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, you can check those out there. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, so Mr. Spencer, why are you going this far into the religious symbolism? Well, stick with me. First, note the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. None of the 4 Gospel writers were alive during Jesus' lifetime, but they wrote down accounts of the stories they heard from previous generations. Okay, many of those gospel writers there, they lived about 80, 90, 100 years after Jesus' lifetime. But they heard the accounts and stories of the crucifixion and the resurrection. Okay, the New Testament describes this. Like Nick and others who were not present during Gatsby's death, like the gospel writers who were not present, our narrator, Nick, or a separate third-person narration, attempts to reconstruct what happened. Okay, Nick wasn't there, but he attempts to reconstruct what happened at the death. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not there at Jesus' crucifixion, but they attempt to reconstruct what happened. Gatsby carrying this mattress, the burden, the cross that he bears. Some critics also argue that the pneumatic mattress symbolizes the inflated, airy, or spiritual romanticism, which gets Gatsby killed. It's what motivates him to keep Daisy's secret about her accidentally killing Myrtle. The same romantic love keeps him awake the night before his death, during his vigil at the Buchanan house, which recalls the vigil that Jesus keeps in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before his crucifixion in Luke chapter 22, verse 43-44. The gardener may symbolize that Gatsby's spiritual garden or moral integrity has been compromised or tainted, and he is evicted from the Garden of Eden, or maybe he's evicted from his mansion, or evicted from life itself. Banished. Modern readers often are confused by the word Holocaust being used in this novel from 1925. However, before the Nazi Holocaust we know of World War II in the 1930s and 40s, where many Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and other people that were not fit for society, the Nazis executed, and many were burned in crematoriums. The word was used before that time period, mostly in a religious context. A Holocaust literally translates from Latin, a thing wholly burnt, or Old French translation of a burnt offering, Holocaust. Man, do you notice anything else? Did I miss anything? The motif of religious imagery and religious motifs have been established throughout the book. I mean, I've noticed the word God. I searched and found it at least 21 times in the book, such as in Daisy's laugh after the beautiful little fool speech on page 17. Sophisticated God! I'm sophisticated, she exclaims. The elevated diction, the biblical syntax used to establish the Valley of Ashes on pages 23-24, the Simon Called Peter novel that Nick is reading drunkenly and discards on page 29. It's about a religious awakening. It was a very popular book in 1920. Fitzgerald didn't like it either. There's the Catholic excuse for why Tom won't divorce Daisy that Catherine posits on page 33. Young James Gatz being described as a son of God on page 98. George Wilson's claim on page 159 that God knows what you've been doing. Everything you've been doing. You may fool me, but you can't fool God before he murders Gatsby. Gatsby apparently committing himself to the following of a grail on page 149, the Holy Grail. And there was a short story Fitzgerald wrote, 1924. It was originally his first attempt at writing the young story of Gatsby. It was called Absolution. All right. And this story by Fitzgerald, he kind of discarded. He thought it would be a prologue or a preface to The Great Gatsby. All right. So many people think it's almost like a young Gatsby narrative. And that's what most people think of it as, because later in life, that's what Fitzgerald said to a fan, that this story was intended to show young Gatsby's early life. And absolution is a word related in a religious context, and it's about a young 11-year-old Catholic who goes to confession, and the priest that he goes to confession with collapses at the end of the story. Okay, it's very interesting there. What else have you found? Did I miss anything? Okay, as I fix up some of my interesting notes here, I'm curious on your final essay, which of these ideas that you think you will be able to write about. 45-minute timed writing. I'd be happy to help you. In my next video, we'll go over what to expect from that timed writing. This is Mr. Spencer signing